All the cars for this test were lent to us by the manufacturers.
We've got a brand new car. It's got 74 kilometers on it.
Except for the Tesla Model 3, which we rented with the Turo app. Along the way, we're speaking with auto industry experts and drivers for their insights on electric vehicles. Hi, Valerie. How do you think it's going to go in Raleigh?
You know, I'm fascinated to find out. I think it's going to be possible to drive and charge in the city limits, but North Carolina is a pretty rural state, and the South is really spread out. So my question is, what's going to happen when you get outside of a city?
Here it comes.
We're ready.
Let me do it. Let me do it.
Okay.
How do you think that's going to go in Houston? It's a pretty big oil town, right?
It is a big oil town, but EVs have been increasing market share here, so it'll be interesting to see how the charging network is built out.
What car are you going to drive?
The Nissan Leaf E+, the one that's got the bigger battery. I guess Nissan's worrying about me getting stranded or something.
I'm going to do something you don't get to do very often in Tokyo because you don't own a car. We're going to Costco! Yay! Yay!
To see Detroit, this really old school manufacturing town, be part of this shift to electric vehicles has been really interesting to watch. General Motors makes the Chevy Bolt I'm driving for this test. The Detroit auto giant is restructuring its business to invest in an electric future and has 20 new battery-powered models debuting globally. GM isn't alone. Ford, Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, Hyundai, and many others all have plans to bring new plug-in vehicles to market. To some extent, they have little choice. Tougher auto emissions regulations around the world are pushing them in this direction. The auto industry is expected to spend about $225 billion on electrification globally over the next few years. But analysts aren't convinced the big bet will pay off. Electric cars accounted for just under 3% of global sales last year. Why is the industry turning to this so hard now? What has changed in the last few years?
There are several real driving factors. Most notable is public opinion, public awareness of climate change. The second factor is there's legislation around the world supporting the move, encouraging automakers to get there. It's going to become more and more difficult for any auto manufacturer in most nations of the country to compete only by providing internal combustion engines. The third piece of this, there's some economics behind it. In the long run, electric vehicles are going to be cheaper for people to own and operate.
But the cars aren't exactly flying off the lot today. Expensive batteries make EVs a pricey option. Most cost $10,000 to $20,000 more than similar-sized gasoline cars. Lee Hawkins met Vince Sheehy, who runs nearly 30 dealerships in the Washington, D.C. area.
How is the electric car market going right now? How are they selling here for you?
Electric vehicles are really just getting off the ground. They're still a very small segment of the overall market.
So how often do you have scenarios where people are not necessarily coming in to look at an electric vehicle and then they say, oh, wow, well, maybe I'll try one of these? Is that very common?
That is very uncommon.
That's what I thought.
It is very difficult to make that educational leap with a customer that's not prepared to talk about an electric vehicle.
Does it make economic sense right now to buy an electric car?
Yeah, it's an interesting math equation to see what you have to spend on electric versus what you're getting from your local government. There are certain states that are fully behind electric, and that brings the cost down to a very reasonable level. I would say the majority of the country, it's still more expensive even with the federal subsidies that are out there, and there's no guarantee that they will last.
Across 8 cities, despite the different cars and life routines, we all shared many common experiences throughout the tests. The cars took some getting used to at first.
We'll see if we can figure this out. This is our first public charging station.
Looks like you just stick it in there.
When you're pressing on the accelerator, when you ease off, the car automatically begins to brake, and that's to preserve the battery.
But once mastered, we found the cars
Zippy.
Pretty zippy.
zippy.
It has a lot of zip to it.
Those of us with the ability to charge the cars at home had a much easier experience.
Charging for the first night.
Whether or not that's an option largely depends on your housing and where you park your car overnight. It's more feasible if you have your own garage or driveway. My colleagues using standard home outlets could typically generate enough charge overnight to carry them through the next day.
Is there any greater feeling than 100% charge?
But for faster charging, many EV owners actually install a charger at home on a higher voltage outlet. I added one at my house, and it cost about $700 for the equipment and about $800 for the electrical work. The average cost in the US for installing a home charger is about $1,400. Those of us living in apartment buildings instead relied on public chargers. They generally found enough to get them around town, but it could be a hassle at times.
There are no chargers in my street. There are several chargers, about 6 that I found so far in my neighborhood directly, about a 5-minute walk from my house. Last night I wanted to charge the car, but all the chargers were full. So we're now on half a charge and keeping our fingers crossed that it's enough to get us through the day.
For errands, commutes, and other short trips, the cars performed well. They had a range that's typical for many new electric vehicles, over 200 miles, and that was more than enough for getting reporters around town.
This thing's still got quite a bit of range after 1 week.
391 kilometers of capacity to go.
So I am about to charge the Leaf for the first time in almost 9 days. I wanted to do an experiment to see how long I could go without charging it if I were to just run my normal errands and do my normal commute.
But problems arose when we took the cars on longer trips outside of city centers.
We are driving from LA to Las Vegas.
More than halfway to Kyoto now.
The island of Rugen. There's some really good fishing for big pike.
In nearly all the road trips, regardless of the city or country, the drives took significantly longer than expected, despite meticulous planning. On Halloween, Valerie drove 2 hours from Raleigh to Wilmington, North Carolina. She ended up getting stuck after driving around for hours looking for a working charger.
It's kind of a hot mess right now driving around Wilmington, North Carolina.
It took her about 8 hours to make it back home, which made her miss trick-or-treating with her kids.
The electric car vehicle in a small town is the Grinch that stole Halloween.
We asked Jaguar about Valerie's road trip. They said growth in the EV market over time will lead to better charging infrastructure, especially for longer journeys. Jaguar also said most of their current EV drivers have a gasoline vehicle as well. My planned road trip didn't go any better. I have made this list of charging stations that we can stop at on the way. I drove from Plymouth, Michigan to Sleeping Bear Dunes, which for me is normally a 10-hour round-trip drive in a gasoline vehicle. But the cold weather kept draining my battery and made it slow to recharge. If you look at the outside temperature, which is 25 degrees, right up there, is dinging us by 34 miles of range. We have turned off the heat several times to save on battery, and we're just freezing our butts off so that we can make it to our destination. I ended up spending 30 hours on the road, 19 of those charging. We spent 6 hours at a charger today, which is the amount of time it should have taken us to drive home in a gas car. So we are worn out. I asked GM about my nightmare of a road trip. I spent 30 hours on the road, back and forth. That's not super feasible for people who aren't just doing this for a test.
Sure.
Is this really a car that you can take out on the road at this point?
You can, but you're a fine example. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat it. Yeah. There are definitely a number of pockets of the country that are much tougher for you to find easy charging and fast charging. The speed of the charge has to increase, and the number of available chargers definitely has to increase. No doubt about it.
Another aspect of bringing these vehicles into your everyday life, especially here in Michigan, is that it gets cold for a good amount of the year. That really affects the battery. So is there a solution for that on the horizon?
It's a normal trade-off. There's not a lot we can do about that in the short term. In the longer term, as batteries get more and more efficient and we get more and more natural range in the car, you'll care less and less that in the extreme temperatures, hot and cold, that you lose a little bit of range.
For many of us, the road trips made one thing clear. Range anxiety is real, and it can be quite traumatic.
There was a moment where the miles were just being eaten away.
So, this is what range anxiety feels like.
We're down to 9%.
I do not want to get stranded. That's a big no-no.
Sort of like Waterworld or Mad Max when you're out on the highway. I find myself thinking, well, where am I going to get fuel? How am I going to get there?
Quiet, silent terror when you're not really sure whether or not we're going to make it back.
We often found ourselves driving slower on the highway and foregoing features on the car to conserve battery.
The downside is that you don't get to enjoy all the cool things about the Jag that make it the Jag. Like the checkered flag mode. You can't use that because it uses too much energy.
Top right corner there, that is the range of the battery. And then watch what happens as I turn the air conditioning fan up.
With so many factors affecting the battery, it was hard to pin down the car's real range.
The range guesstimate was kind of off. You know, we did about 80 kilometers, but lost about 150 kilometers worth of range. I guess maybe it was highway speeds.
The range is going down more quickly than we anticipated, and we don't know if we're going to make it to the charger that we were planning to charge at.
Hyundai, Mercedes, Jaguar, and Nissan each said their vehicles serve the day-to-day needs of a variety of drivers. The automakers told us that road conditions, driving styles, and certain features affect the range of both gasoline and electric vehicles. And each manufacturer pointed to technology on their cars designed to help EV drivers avoid getting stuck, such as route planning tools, real-time updates on range, and assistance finding chargers. A lot of us also experienced frustrating deficiencies in the public charging network, and not just in places like northern Michigan and rural North Carolina. Even in global auto capitals like Japan and Germany, where car companies are stepping up investment in EVs, our reporters found the charging infrastructure lacking. While in China, James Arity found the most abundant and easiest public charging in our test.
These charging stations seem to be all over in the city in Shanghai, and it's from what I can tell from the map, they're all over the country.
Everywhere else, available public stations were a hodgepodge. Charging at a new spot often meant having to figure out a new registration or interface.
The thing can't be used, even though it's free, can't be used without a 9-step registration process in which I have to wait for an email to arrive in my mailbox.
We often encountered machines that were broken, slower than expected, or simply occupied.
One charging station at the hotel.
Nobody's parked an EV in the EV spots.
Okay, we're sort of in unmitigated disaster area now, because look, it's blinking red. Why? We don't know. It's charging. No, it's not.
No matter how fast the station, charging these vehicles adds a lot of time to a trip, compared to refueling a gasoline vehicle.
These chargers are effective, but pretty slow, so we have some time to kill.
Half an hour.
While I'm waiting for my charging, a bowl of noodles.
We've been sitting here for an hour and 12 minutes.
There are plenty of free charging stations, but when we did have to pay, it was sometimes surprisingly expensive. Some stations set the rate based on time spent charging, others by kilowatt hour, and the price of electricity varies across the U.S.
It ended up costing a little over $35. So if I was doing this once a week, it'd probably be more than I currently spend on gas.
Where our reporters encountered a patchwork of charging infrastructure, experts told us it's largely because there isn't one single entity responsible for building it out. Rather, in the U.S., it's a mixture of private landowners, nonprofits, and companies like ChargePoint and Electrify America trying out different business models. Tesla was an outlier in our test. In 2012, the electric car maker began building out its own network of fast charging stations, so Tesla drivers don't have to rely on public charging. Tesla says it now has more than 1,800 supercharger stations worldwide and nearly 750 in the US. Lee easily found places to plug in his Tesla Model 3, whether it was during longer road trips or routine errands.
There's just tons of options. All of these little lightning bolts are supercharging stations.
Some of us were jealous of Tesla's charging infrastructure.
The takeaway for today is if you're in Wilmington and you have a Tesla, you're probably set. So many open spaces at the Tesla. There's approximately 14 Tesla stations near us, 2 non-Tesla stations, and one of them is broken.
But Lee did encounter lines at a station on the drive between New York and D.C.
As you can see, they can't get in because all of the charging stations are already full.
And a fast and abundant network doesn't remove the need to plan for charging time.
The major challenge of the trip was just the hour that we had to spend charging. That's just part of the game. Like when you decide that you're going to purchase an electric car, you have to build that into your expectations.
Tesla did not respond to our requests for comment. Buying an electric car right now means changing some habits and accepting some trade-offs. While visiting charging stations around Los Angeles, Eric Schwartzel met EV owners who have embraced these cars and all that comes with them.
Hey, thanks. Have a good one. Thanks for all your help. Everyone in this world is so nice. The woman we met this morning, Kathy, was telling me that she games it for herself and she'll try to get to Vegas and back on one charge. It's this real daredevil move to try and make it. Her range is 250, so she'll make a 270-mile trip with no AC. Hey, how are you?
Hey, what's going on? It's a good car. No maintenance, never been to the shop. Just replaced the tires, never replaced the brakes. It has 100,000 miles on it. I bought this used for about $4,000, and it's been the best investment that I bought.
But Eric also met drivers who had struggled with the switch to an electric car.
Well, I only had it for 8 months. I've always wanted one since they came out, and I was finally able to get one, but it just didn't work out for me.
Why is that?
Because the charging stations in Los Angeles are few and far between.
Where chargers are lacking, nonprofits have stepped in to try and fill some of the holes. Kitty Adams runs one of them. Eric met her at a free charging station she helped install at the LA Zoo.
Where is there still a dearth of charging infrastructure in the United States?
When the initial investment was going into EV charging, I saw them really getting crowded in commercial zones, which is great. But, rarely do I ever need that charger at the drugstore by my house. Where I really need it is when I'm driving 40 miles to Leo Carrillo State Beach.
More unconventional locations.
Yeah, so it's really important to have that EV charger there because otherwise people can't take that trip. But having said that, you can't make a case for commercializing that charger because it's just not going to get used enough to actually, see a return on your investment.
So it has to be
so that's why
sponsored
the
and nonprofit model
fills the gap there. Really, I wanted to look at it purely from the EV driver perspective. Where do they need to add range to their vehicle? Where are the places they want to go?
Governments in the major auto markets of Europe, Japan, and the U.S. are all pushing car companies to sell more EVs by setting stricter auto emissions limits and incentivizing drivers to buy them. But perhaps nowhere in the world is there a bigger focus on EVs than in China. The Chinese government is aggressively promoting the technology, setting ambitious sales targets and regulating automakers to build more electric vehicles. It's also helping to subsidize the expansion of the charging network.
Here in Shanghai, I've taken delivery of this.
In Shanghai, James Arity felt this investment and had a smoother test than most of us.
So I've lived in Shanghai more than a dozen years, going on 2 decades. And driving is immensely stressful. You have 20 million people packed into roads which were designed in many cases for horses.
A huge advantage to the EV business in China is the fact that the state is involved, the government is involved. You don't have to wait around for private companies to do all of the work. This is China State Grid. It's one of the largest state-owned enterprises, and they've set up these EV stations all over the country.
James spoke to auto industry analyst Bill Russo about China's approach to electric vehicles.
So what can you tell us about the EV market in China? What makes it different from, say, the U.S. market?
What's different is in China, they've made it a national agenda to repower transportation.
So China could take leadership in an EV, but they're not going to in a traditional gasoline-powered vehicle market.
It's playing a decades-long game of catch-up. There is not a single electric vehicle company in China that has had to build a supercharger network for its cars. All of that investment in EV charging infrastructure is coming from public and private investments outside of the automotive industry. Heck, did Henry Ford have to build the gasoline fueling infrastructure for the United States? No. Standard Oil helped with that.
So has it been successful, do you think, the electrification of the industry?
Half of the total sales of electric vehicles in the world are now sold here in China. So absolutely, it's gotten off the ground. Now, can it achieve, escape velocity to where it's competing head-to-head with the internal combustion engine? I think that's going to take several years.
Around the world, governments and automakers are emphasizing electric vehicles. German car makers are making some of the biggest investments. And Germany has made EVs a policy priority as part of their aim to be carbon neutral by 2050.
So here we're passing through a small wind farm.
So they're aggressively regulating their auto manufacturers and subsidizing the purchase of EVs. But they're betting on a technology that is still new and strange to most drivers.
When I was much younger, I had a car that I could fix myself. I could do engine tune-ups, the brakes, I could change all the parts. But I've never seen anything like this. This is completely different. This is not your father's Mercedes.
In places like Germany, the government and automakers want more EVs on the road, and soon. But the push hasn't yet translated into a better experience for drivers.
I pull into a gas station, and you think this would be a nice place to put an electric charger, right? But of course, there are none here. And this is a fundamental problem. They call it the chicken and egg problem, right? How are you going to have enough electric cars on the road if you can't charge them? Why should I put electric chargers up if there aren't so many electric cars on the road? Someone's got to solve that problem.
While this technology has improved since the first electric vehicle hit the road more than 2 decades ago, a lot of big challenges remain. And that includes your range, where you can plug in, and the base cost of these vehicles, which is pretty expensive. Our reporters found that when it comes to their daily routines, they could make these cars work.
I'm running out to pick up some Krispy Kreme donuts for my son's 10th birthday. It just strikes me as the perfect type of errand to run in this car.
Once I got used to the charging rhythm and when there were adequate charging opportunities, it was a minor inconvenience. It meant planning ahead, but it's certainly doable.
I was vaguely aware that EV was quite popular in China, but I guess I was surprised at how much easier it was to use it, to plug it in, than I expected.
But breaking out of those routines and taking these cars the distance involved anxiety and compromise.
Within 24 hours was telling people that I wish that I had bought an electric vehicle whenever I leased my last car. But since then, I have to say I've had a bit of a change of heart. The Vegas trip was pretty traumatizing because of the challenges of finding a charger.
Charging just takes forever, and there's just not enough of it in the places where you want to drive to.
At this point, though, I would want to have a second vehicle, a conventional one for longer trips.
More models of electric vehicles are on the way, and car companies say the technology and infrastructure will improve. Automakers are wagering billions that the future is electric. But is it enough? One thing's for sure. Their plans will be tested on the long road ahead.